And we're live. Hi, everybody. I'm Ryan Schumacher. Welcome to, week 4 for Bible Geeks. This is, again, the Sunday school class, the Bible study class going in parallel with the sermon series at the First Presbyterian Church of River Forest in the fall of 2017 on the covenants. And so today, we've got two episodes for today because we're going to try and condense basically, Numbers, Deuteronomy, Joshua, Judges, 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings, 1st and 2nd Chronicles, Ezra, and Nehemiah, all into one. Are you ready? So the two segments, we're going to go through basically Numbers through Judges, and then we're going to go through 1st Samuel through Ezra and Nehemiah in the second one. And it's going to be on, so this one it says here, the wandering, the conquest, and the period of the Judges. So, the purpose of this is to tell the story of Israel in light of the covenant at Sinai. So the last time that we spoke for the week 3 episodes, that was specifically about the covenant at Sinai. What made it different? This was a vassal covenant. Here were the terms. We went through Leviticus. We went through the cleanliness laws. We went through the holiness code and the moral laws. We talked about the blessings and the curses. We talked about God dwelling among the Israelites. And then the contingencies with that. So if they obeyed, they received blessing right there, right then. If they disobeyed, they received cursing, or as Pastor Paul said this morning rather well, anti-blessing, right there, right then. So in light of this arrangement now, my thesis, what I'm proposing to all of you is that once you grasp that, what happened in the covenant, then everything else that happened in Israel's history is going to make sense. And so today, this one here is going to be about making sense of the Post-Sinai history in light of the covenant. So this one, we're going to talk about the wandering. After they left Sinai, we're going to talk about the conquest of Canaan and the covenant blessings. And then we're going to address the question of divine sanctioned genocide, or alleged divine sanctioned genocide, the moral challenge of the conquest. This is something that many skeptics point at, and we're going to spend a lot of time on that. I think it's incredibly important. And then we'll talk about the period of the Judges. So if the conquest of Canaan was covenant blessing, then the period of the Judges is covenant cursing. We're going to see that as well as the restoration after repentance. So covenant blessings, you're looking at Leviticus 26, 1 through 12. The curses would be 13 through 39, and then the restoration after repentance would be 40 through 45. You're going to see how all of that, what we went over in the week 3 video on the book of Leviticus, how everything that happened after that makes sense in the context of that covenant. Excuse me if I cough a little bit, I'm getting over a bit of a cold. So, again, just a quick summary previously on God's story. So the covenant was made with Israel at Sinai in Exodus 19, the Shekinah glory. So the presence of God now is dwelling among them. Leviticus 26:12, I will walk with you and be your God, and you will be my people. Exodus 40, the tabernacle, the glory of the Lord fills the tabernacle. Now, for the first time since Eden, God is again dwelling with his people. All right, so they stayed at Sinai a year. The book of Leviticus happens during that period of time, where they stay at Sinai for a year. The tabernacle is completed a year after the Exodus. So the Exodus from Egypt takes place. The tabernacle is built. So Exodus chapter 40 is taking place roughly a year after the Exodus. And then God commands them to take a census. All right, so the first census, that takes you, if we went Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers chapter 1 is that census. So Numbers is going to narrate the events from the departure from Sinai a year later up to the land of Canaan. And so it begins with the census of Israel. So if you see on this map here, so the blue line is the Exodus. So they're leaving Egypt. Mount Sinai, then down there where the blue line meets the yellow line. So they stayed there for a year. The first census that we're about to see takes place there. And then they head up to a place called Kadesh Barnea. And that'll be where we have kind of I would say, one of the pivotal moments in the book of Numbers. Perhaps the most important part of the story in the book of Numbers. If you look at here, you look at the census in Numbers 1 through 4, you look at sending the spies out in Kadesh Barnea in 1314, and then Numbers 26, the second census. Those are going to be your markers through the book of Numbers if you wanted to follow redemptive history. So in Numbers 13, the Lord spoke to Moses, "Send men out to scout the land of Canaan I am giving to the Israelites." All right, it's time, right? Land was promised. Here we are. God has brought the people with whom he has made a covenant, with whom he is dwelling, with whom he has promised victory and land. He's led them to the land, says, "Send some men out to the land that I'm giving to you." So he's giving them that land. There's no equivocation here. This land will belong to you. Send men out to scout that. See what the land is like, whether the people who live there are strong or weak, few or many. Is this the land they live in good or bad? Are the cities they live in encampments or unproductive? Are there trees in it or not? Now, interesting thing here, it might look like, I guess based on the way that I've constructed the slide, it might look like God is saying that. So for the sake of clarity on that, if you look at number 17, so the verse prior, this is actually Moses speaking. So Moses is giving the orders to the spies and sending them out at that point, telling them what to look for. Okay, what's wrong with this? It sure seems like the way that Moses has set this up, see if they're strong or weak. Are there a lot of them? Are there a few of them? Is the land really good or is it bad? Are they encampments? Like, are there real cities there? Or are they unproductive? Are there trees? So is God's promise really true? Is kind of what's happening at this point. In particular here, whether they are strong or weak, few or many, what were the covenant blessings? If they were obedient, one of them would defeat 100, and 100 of them would defeat 10,000. It doesn't matter if they're strong or weak, few or many. Is the land they live in good and bad? They're told it was flowing with milk and honey. Okay, this is the land that was promised, and it seems like there's a little bit of shakiness. Perhaps curiosity, but which, I mean, you can't help but be curious. If God's promised you this amazing land and you're going there, okay, is it really that amazing? But the part there about are the people who live there strong or weak, few or many, is foreshadowing the problems that are going to take place. So the spies come back, and indeed, the land is flowing with milk and honey, but the people in the land are strong, their cities are large and fortified. So the kind of thing that they feared, yeah, these are strong people, they have big armies, they have fortifications around their cities. That turns out to be true as well. And so the response of the people, the spies come back and bring this report. Yes, it's as good as they said, but they're like big scary giants there with fortified cities, and we're very nervous about it. The response of the people, the response of the Israelites, we can't go up against the people because they're stronger than we are. Even, like, look at this. Look at, I picked this quote out in particular. I'd forgotten that the passage said this. If only we had died in the land of Egypt. Why is Yahweh, why is the Lord bringing us into this land to die by the sword? So, contrast back here. The Lord spoke to Moses, "Send men to scout out the land of Canaan I'm giving to the Israelites." 2, if only we died, why is the Lord bringing us into this land to die by the sword? So they're horrified about what's happening. There is clearly a lack of trust that God will actually deliver on this. And, keep in mind, this is the same people that saw what God had accomplished in Egypt when bringing them out of Egypt during the Exodus. It's the same people. They've seen that, and yet their response here is that they're just being, sent to the slaughter. And so the narrator then comments, the whole community threatened to stone them. This is Moses, and Moses and Aaron, all of them saying, no, we should go in. So basically everybody's ready to go after Moses and Aaron and saying, nope, we are not going into that land, and if you guys are going to take us there, then no confidence in you as our rulers. Well, the glory of the Lord appeared to all the Israelites at the tent of meeting. Okay, so right as they're about to make a big deal out of this and maybe put the whole, going into Canaan thing to an end, God shows up. God's got something to say about all this. So the glory of the Lord shows up. How long will they not trust in me, despite all the signs I have performed for them? I will strike them with a plague and destroy them. Then I will make you into a greater and mightier nation than they are. So this is God talking to Moses about what's happening. So striking them with a plague, this is a curse. This is a curse of disobedience. Deuteronomy 28:51 mentions the plague. You see the plague and pestilence all through Leviticus 26 as well. And notice, make you into a greater nation. So Yahweh is basically saying here, okay, covenant curses are going to come down. Great nation, though, will still exist through you, Moses. I will make you into a greater nation than they are. So the promise to Abraham is still there. But God is basically saying this level of disobedience will bring about a covenant curse. Now Moses intercedes. Now Moses has been doing this a lot. Moses did this at the time of the golden calf. We didn't spend too much time on that. But God was ready to end it right then and there. And Moses intercedes. Moses intercedes on behalf of Israel again. And notice what he says. You are slow to anger and rich in faithful love. This is Exodus 34:6. This is God's autobiography. This is, we talked about that a lot in the week 3 video. Yahweh's slow to anger, compassionate and gracious, rich in steadfast loving kindness and truth. This is Yahweh's self-description. So Moses says, hey, this is who you are. Please pardon your people for their disobedience. Awfully nice coming from the guy who was just about to be stoned by the people. And so Yahweh's response, I have pardoned them as you requested. Yet as surely as I live, these are the important words, as surely as I live, none of the men who have seen my glory and the signs I performed in Egypt and in the wilderness, and have tested me these 10 times and did not obey me, will ever see the land I swore to give their fathers. Except for Caleb. He's cool. So what Yahweh is saying is, okay, I'm not going to strike them with a plague now. As I said, I will not execute a curse of the covenant now, but he is still going to hold them accountable for their disobedience. And so what we're seeing here is the promise, is God saying that the people who have been disobeying will not inherit the land, despite the fact that they will still go into the land. That's what's about to happen here. So so you have the Exodus, you have Numbers chapter 1, they go up to Kadesh Barnea. So this is right here where this yellow line is, Israel's refusal to trust God there. And God says, okay, that generation whom I have shown all these signs and still won't obey, that generation will not inherit the land. So now you see the wandering. So this green right here, the wandering of the rebellious generation. The wandering that takes place for the next 40 years. If you've wondered why they wandered in the desert for 40 years, it's about to make sense here. Because upon the occasion of the second census in Numbers 26, so there's another census taking place, and what happens after the whole, the census begins in Numbers 26:1, so verses 64-65 after you get to the end. But among them there was not one of those who had been registered by Moses and Aaron the priest when they registered the Israelites in the wilderness of Sinai. For the Lord had said to them that they would all die in the wilderness. None of them was left except for Caleb and Joshua. So the wandering is God bringing out his punishment against the disobedient generation, yet still fulfilling his promise to Israel that they as a nation will inherit the land, still fulfilling the promise to Abraham that that land would go to his descendants. But that particular disobedient generation was, they went in circles until that generation was gone. So that was God's punishment for the disobedience of the people and the refusal to trust him. It's really rather remarkable that there would be a refusal of trust after everything that had been done. after the Exodus, after Sinai, after the covenant, after like all that they had gone through to that point. It just goes back to what I mentioned in that video the previous week. Why the question of why doesn't God just perform a miracle every now and then? The human heart is so rebellious and will wander no matter what and remains unconvinced. And we see just more evidence of it right here, that those signs to these people was still not enough. So the disobedience wrought the covenant curse, yet Israel was preserved. So this is where we understand the corporate identity of Israel. Israel is still around. Israel as a nation is still alive and well, even though those individuals received the punishment. So the promise to Abraham, yes, is still in view because they're about to enter the land. So they arrive at the plains of Moab after the wandering around there. So that green circle, they're at the plains of Moab after the second census. And then Moses gives them a pep talk known as the book of Deuteronomy. So if you look, book of Deuteronomy, Moses is talking for most of the book of Deuteronomy. So that's my Old Testament professor called it the world's greatest pep talk. And then at the end of it, they go over once again sort of a covenant renewal. They review the law, they review the blessings, they review the curses, and then they're now told to go into the land. So after Moses' death, then Joshua takes over as the human leader of Israel. So that's recorded at the end of Deuteronomy. It's also Joshua chapter 1. And he's charged with leading the Israelites to drive the Canaanites out of the land and to claim that land as Israel's covenantal right. So the thing that they were supposed to do in Numbers 13 and 14, that they refused to do, that then brought about the covenant curse. Now they have come back, and Moses is like, okay, remember what happened here the last time. We are renewing our covenant with God right now, and we will trust Yahweh to bring us to victory here. After all, remember the blessings for obedience. We were promised this land. We were promised victory as long as we were obedient. Let this not happen to us again. And so now they have been pep talked into saying, okay, even though there are many of them, even though they have fortified cities, we will go. So Yahweh's promise of the covenant blessing of victory, you will pursue your enemies, they will fall before you by the sword. They're going to now claim the land of promise that was promised to Abraham's descendants. So, what do we see in Joshua? They encounter victory when they're faithful. They encounter defeat when they're unfaithful. This is exactly what you would expect, given the outline of Leviticus 26, Deuteronomy 28, the blessings and the curses. So when they're faithful, they succeeded against Jericho, despite overwhelming odds. We don't have time to go into the whole story of Jericho, but many of you know the story already, where they surrounded the city, even though the city was strongly fortified. They circled around the city. God told them how this is going to happen. They shouted at the walls. The walls fell, and they were able to take Jericho. So 5 of you will pursue 100, 100 of you will pursue 10,000. Your enemies will fall before you. So when they're faithful, they're successful. They encounter defeat when they're unfaithful. So then Joshua chapter 7 comes right afterwards. So their defeat at Ai, so the next city they go to, is attributed to one of them, Achan, keeping some of what was set apart for destruction. So remember, they were told to leave nothing standing as far as the Canaanite worship implements. They were to be fully separate from this culture. Nothing of the cultural worship of the Canaanites was to survive. So when some of the spoils are kept, rather than destroyed as they were supposed to be, and we'll get into that in a bit, they lose. And in Joshua chapter 7, it is very clearly attributed to because one of theirs kept something that was devoted to destruction, they suffered defeat. Ai is then conquered when Achan and his family are dealt with, and they were executed for this unfaithfulness. Then once that happened, and the implements that they kept with them were destroyed, they once again went against Ai, and they encountered victory. So we're seeing the way that it was set up in Leviticus 26, Deuteronomy 28. If you are faithful, you will win. If you are unfaithful, you will lose. That is how things go in Joshua. So in the book of Joshua, the conquest, the question of how do we know Israel was faithful during this time? Well, the conquest was successful. That's the best way to put it. Yahweh was with them. They were able to drive the Canaanites out of the land. Victory was a covenant blessing. Other ways that so Yahweh was in frequent communication with the Israelites. On many occasions, there's, Joshua 1, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 11, 13, 20, 24. And many times within those chapters, all record direct statements from Yahweh to the Israelites. So, this is when Yahweh promises to walk with them. He will turn his face towards them. He will be with them and be their God, and they will be his people. You can see that happening when Yahweh is in communication with them and when they are doing what they are told to do. The flip side of that would be if Yahweh is silent, if they're encountering defeat, then they are in a state of disobedience. This is covenant cursing. So, and finally, there's peace in the land. Remember, that was one of the covenant blessings as well. The Lord gave Israel rest from their enemies. It's a promise of peace in the land. So going through the markers in Joshua, we can look at the time of the conquest and say, this was a time when Israel was faithful. And you can do that by looking at the covenant blessing markers and say, okay, throughout this period, on balance, they were faithful. All right, so let's take on this question. So going into the land, conquering the Canaanites, destroying most of what was there, including the people. Is this God-sanctioned genocide? This is part of the Bible that's attacked the most, I'll say. Seen by some as Yahweh acting. I remember one person who told me that Yahweh was just an ancient Israelite war god or an ancient Jewish war god, and they followed what they believed their war god told them and just eradicated the other people in that area because they were different. So is this an accurate portrayal of what's happening? I've spoken to people even recently who look at this and say this is something that really makes them uncomfortable. God-sanctioned genocide, I think, was even... I took that term from one of them that I spoke with recently because I think, let's take this question straight on. This is what some people think of the book of Joshua, and it's one of the things they call morally reprehensible about the Bible. All right, so we're going to look at this phrase, driving out the Canaanites. I want you to keep that phrase in mind. We're going to go into it specifically, but let's start with this. What do we know about the Canaanites? What do we know about these people? Basically, to summarize it, we don't have a ton of time to go into each piece of evidence, but these people engaged in absolutely wicked practices. So, one example, Will Durant from his book, The Story of Civilization. So living children were sacrificed. They were placed upon the inclined and outstretched arms of the idol, rolled off into the fire beneath. Their cries were drowned out in the noise of trumpets and cymbals. Their mothers were required to watch, but watch without reaction, for fear of impiety. So if they reacted at all when their children were placed on the arms of an idol and rolled into a fire, they would be punished. And of course, when things were really egregious, then they said, okay, we need higher class children. And so they started going up to take the children of aristocrats. So now, in sometimes, if the offenses that they were trying to atone for, that they were trying to get their gods to do what they wanted through sacrifice, if they didn't think it was that big of a deal, sometimes the aristocrats would pay off to have other children taken in their children's place for the purpose of sacrificing to these gods. It's just horrifying that this took place. And then other Canaanite worship practices were completely debased. Sacred prostitution, orgiastic rites. So John Bright recalls this in the history of Israel. A good God cannot be at peace with such wickedness. That just cannot this will not coexist with Yahweh. That will not happen in Yahweh's sacred space. So what was God's command to Israel? You are to drive out the Hivites. Little by little, I will drive them out. This is Yahweh speaking. He will drive them out. Obey what I command to you today. I will drive out before you the Amorites, Canaanites, Hittites, etc. I will drive out the nations before you. Do not defile yourself in any of these ways, because this is how the nations that I am going to drive out before you became defiled. By the way, that's a really important one. Leviticus 18, this is in particular the beginning of some of the prohibitions against many sexual practices. Do not defile yourself in any of these ways, because this is how the nations I am going to drive out became defiled. So, you're associating these practices with two things. First, they are defiling to the people, and second, they are the things that the Canaanites are doing, and God is commanding Israel not to be like them. The Lord your God will drive out all these nations before you. Okay, here you go. Look at the phrase drive out. Here is everywhere in the books of Moses and Joshua where you see the phrase drive out. So it's highlighted all over the place, and you see, drive them out, drive out, 34:11, Amorites, Canaanites, Hittites, Perizzites, Hivites, drive out the inhabitants of the land a few times, your enemies before you. He will drive out many nations. So that's the context. We're talking about driving them out. You get the point. There's over 50 references to driving out the Canaanites. So, drive out, we have an idea of what that means. If you're going to drive something out, you're pushing it away. It's not, regular vernacular. It's not the way we normally talk, but we know what murder sounds like. We know what exterminate means. It doesn't mean drive out. These are different categories. Just because you drive something out doesn't mean you eradicate it. You drive out snow from your driveway, but that doesn't mean you go melt it. You push it away. So the reason for these past couple slides is to make it abundantly clear what is the command. The command is to drive them out. We'll look at what that means, but the command was not exterminate. You don't see that. Driving out is the command, and even if you can find a translation that might say that at one point, which perhaps you can. I haven't looked that up specifically. I'm just going to direct you back here and say the way that this command is given is to drive them out. That's the overwhelming characterization of what they're supposed to do. What can't Israel do? Israel cannot make a treaty with them. Israel cannot leave their worship implements standing. Israel cannot intermarry with them. So these are the things that they are to drive them out. Do not make a treaty with them. Do not make leave any of their worship implements standing. You look at this, and then intermarriage. When you look at the frequency here, the number of times these particular things are mentioned, the thing that seems to be bothering God the most about what they're doing is their worship. It's their religious practices, their wrong worship. That Leviticus chapter isn't even in here, where it talks about the defiling of the nations that they will be driving out based on their practices, which happen to be worship practices. So the thing that matters is their wrong worship. And why can't Israel do any of these things? Israel can't make a treaty with them and live amongst them. Israel cannot intermarry with them because, and you see this, once you get into Judges, you see this clearly. Maybe one of the best individual examples is that of Solomon. They are not to make a treaty. They are not to leave any of their temples. They are not to intermarry with them. You see this in Numbers 25 too. So that Israel would not be like these people. So that they would not worship, they would not act or treat God or treat themselves, others, in these ways. Israel is to not be like them. Israel is to be holy. Israel is to be different. And they're not to engage in the wicked practices that we talked about before. They're to drive them out. They're not to be at peace with these kinds of practices in the land. So Deuteronomy 12, I think, makes this case pretty clearly. So destroy completely all of the places on the high mountains and on the hills and under every spreading tree where the nations you are dispossessing worship their gods. Break down their altars, smash their sacred stones, burn their Asherah poles in the fire, cut down the idols of their gods, and wipe out their names from those places. You must not worship the Lord your God in that way. So if you make a treaty with them and you live amongst them, there's the potential for syncretism. If you leave their temple standing, there's the temptation to using their worship places. If you intermarry, you are going to be influenced by that in their worship practices. They are not to be like that. You must not worship the Lord your God in that way. Nothing that resembles this kind of false worship of false gods will be allowed in God's land. This is the one true God. This is the God that has declared everything his temple, saying that this, profane worship that involves child sacrifice and orgiastic rites and temple prostitution and everything is just completely anathema to any right worship and completely anathema to what human beings are made for. That will not be allowed. Remember Babel? Remember when Israel built the ziggurat to try and worship God in that way? It wasn't Israel at that time, I'm sorry. Remember when the Shemites built the ziggurat and tried to worship Yahweh the way that the others worship their gods? Yahweh despises defiling worship practices. This is completely disallowed. Okay. Excuse me. Now, this is perhaps the most important part of the whole thing. We got to look at the case of Rahab. So Rahab was a Canaanite woman who lived in Jericho, which is the first city that Israel attacked, the first Canaanite city they went after. Rahab hid 2 Israelite spies in her room, sent the king's men off in another direction. So they were being pursued. Rahab hid the Israelite spies. And one of the things that Rahab said to the Israelite spies were, Yahweh your God is God in heaven above and on earth below. So this is a quote from Rahab, one of the Canaanites in Joshua chapter 2. So she is affirming that Yahweh is the true God. Let's pause here for a moment to make sure that sinks in. Rahab, Canaanite woman, living in a city that's devoted to destruction, helps the Israelites and claims Yahweh is the true God. So what happened to her when Jericho was conquered? Was she, because she was a Canaanite, was she, eradicated? Was she driven out? Joshua chapter 6. Joshua spared Rahab the prostitute and her family and all who belonged to her because she hid the men Joshua had sent as spies into Jericho, and she lives in the midst of the Israelites to this day. So Rahab was not dispatched. Rahab was kept with Israel. She was allowed to live among them. Now, and 2 verses later, the Lord was with Joshua and his fame sped throughout the land. Okay, so despite the fact that this Canaanite family is living with Israel, they are not to make treaties, they are not to intermarry, they are not to leave any of these things standing. They are to drive the Canaanites out of the land. So you would think that, leaving some of the Canaanites, if the command was to exterminate all the Canaanites, keeping one and her whole family with you would lead to covenant cursing. Remember, disobedience leads to covenant curses. And remember what happened to Ai. And so this is going to be the most important part. Remember at Ai when Achan kept something he wasn't supposed to. This is the same section of Scripture. This is Joshua 7. What we just looked at here. The Lord was with Joshua and his fame spread throughout the land. This is after he has allowed Rahab to stay with them. And yet in Joshua chapter 7, when Achan keeps something, then there's the covenant curse of defeat. They killed, that says Ai and his family, killed Achan and his family, and they were restored to covenant blessing. So, okay, let's look at this juxtaposition here. Rahab and her whole family are Canaanites. They are supposed to be driven out, apparently. They stay. Joshua says they can stay. and Joshua's fame expands, and the Lord is with him. Achan keeps something. In the very next chapter, they get covenant curses, and then Achan and his family are killed. And then blessing is restored. How does this make sense? How do you bring these two things together? God brought judgment upon Achan for keeping something that was devoted to destruction, but sparing a Canaanite woman and letting her stay with Israel didn't invoke judgment? What's happening here? She's one of them. She was a low social status, but she believed Yahweh was the true God. And the result, she's allowed to stay with them with God's approval. Rahab is in the genealogy of Jesus in Matthew 1:5. She's put alongside Abraham in James chapter 2, 23 through 25 as an example of faith. James chapter 2. So the scripture was fulfilled that says, Abraham believed God, it was credited to him as righteousness, and he was called God's friend. So you see that a person is considered righteous by what they do and not by faith alone. In the same way, was not even Rahab the prostitute considered righteous for what she did when she gave lodging to the spies and sent them off, the king's men off in a different direction, as well as the spies, I suppose. So the New Testament is not neutral on Rahab. It actually speaks very positively. So it has put Rahab, a Canaanite prostitute, woman of low social status, who is one of them, in the lineage of the Messiah, the deliverer of Israel, the deliverer of all humanity. And she's held up as an example by the brother of Jesus, the leader of the church in Jerusalem, alongside Abraham. Of all the examples he could have picked David. He could have picked, Jeremiah. He could have picked Hezekiah. He picks Rahab. What's happening here? Because she believed that Yahweh was the true God, she gets to stay, basically. It's not about her ethnic status. It's about, it's about her confessional belief in Yahweh being the true God and acting basically like the Israelites. If she did as the Israelites were supposed to, she's allowed to stay. And Israel, when they're disobedient, they don't get a free pass. Remember, there's covenant curses for worshiping other gods. So Achan, even though he is ethnically Israelite, he doesn't get a free pass. He's disobedient. Covenant curses come upon the nation, and he suffers a far worse fate than Rahab does. So an Israelite and his family gets executed for disobeying the covenant. Rahab, a Canaanite, who is ethnically other, is obedient and gets to stay. So Israel engages in the practices of the Canaanites. They incur the wrath of God. And so now, this is maybe a little bit of an appendix, but what are the nations outside of Canaan? So the non-Israelite nations outside of Canaan. The Israelites are allowed to make treaties with them and coexist with them. So the point of that is that just because they are non-Israelite doesn't mean the command is to go and eradicate the world of everybody who isn't like you. That is not what it's about. It's about these people in this land at this time driving out the non-believers. And if they do believe they can stay, and you drive out the non-believers from your presence too, even if they are ethnically Israelite, as they did with Achan. So, let's put it all together, including fixing the animation once I redo these slides for the class later. So Canaanite society was wicked, perverted, and debased. Their worship practices were to be eradicated. They were to be driven out of the land. This is not extermination. Israel was to never be like them. Nothing in Canaanite religious culture was to be preserved, but they were to drive them out. It's about worship behavior. It's not about ethnicity. Canaanites who acknowledged that Yahweh was the true God could stay, like Rahab. Israelites who behaved like Canaanites were subject to curses and had to leave. Other nations that did not occupy Canaan could coexist peacefully with Israel. So these wicked people were to be driven out. The command was not eradication, because after all, if they believed in Yahweh, they could stay. And it didn't matter what your ethnicity was. If you didn't believe in Yahweh, you had to go. And didn't matter if you were a Canaanite outside of the land, that was not the scope of what they were doing. They were not doing some sort of ethnic cleansing of all non-Israelites. Therefore, the Canaanites had a choice. They could convert or they could leave. That's basically what this is leading to. Those that converted, Rahab, could stay. If they left, they could leave the land and be like the other nations with whom Israel could coexist peacefully. If they did neither, Israel did not tolerate them in their evil ways and to go to war. So that's what's happening here. That's it. When you look at this, look at it through that lens. Driving out the Canaanites. This land here, this land was dedicated as sacred land to Yahweh. Yahweh, the God of the universe, has claimed it for himself. That is his right. And now his people, his chosen people, the people through whom he was going to bring blessing to the world, the people with whom he is dwelling, will occupy this land. And that land is going to be the land where his sacred space will be established. Nothing defiling can be in God's sacred space. That is not allowed. So, all of the defiling practices must be purged. They must be driven out. If the people would act basically like the priests, if they converted, they could stay. That's what happened with Rahab. If they left, the sacred space would not be defiled. If they did neither, then everything would have to be eradicated. But there is to be nothing left in that space that would defile God, because that is where he was going to have his dwelling. So that is why you end up seeing the war taking place. And I hope that that helps bring this together a little bit and at least explain why the practices were what they were. But yeah, if I had to just finish it with one thing, I would say the conquest is not about God being some kind of cosmic racist. That's not what's happening. If you hear that, these are people who are ignorant of the scriptures. These are people who don't understand that a Canaanite prostitute is in the lineage of Jesus and is proudly mentioned by Jesus' brother and the leader of the early church in Jerusalem as an example of faith next to the patriarch Abraham. It's not about ethnicity. It's about right worship. God has been very consistent through all of this. So we'll move on now past Joshua. So, the end of Joshua, Joshua does something very similar to Moses at the very end, recounts their history, recounts their faithfulness and the covenant blessing, and then says, we must continue to be faithful as we have been, for look how the Lord has blessed us. So after the death of Joshua, then you get the book of Judges. So the book of Joshua opens with, after the death of Moses, which is signifying a new era. After the death of Joshua is now signifying a new era, which is where the book of Judges starts. And Judges also begins much the same way Joshua did. So after the death of Moses, Joshua is in charge. God speaks to Joshua and says, let's go into the land. Talks about a military campaign. Judges begins with, after the death of Joshua, Yahweh speaks to them about a military campaign. And there's initially success. Judah is successful. So the blessing continues there. But later, though, they were not faithful in driving out the Canaanites. So Benjamin, Manasseh, Ephraim, Zebulun, Asher, Naphtali, Dan all did not drive out the Canaanites. Some of them were even kept in forced labor. What was the command? The command was to drive them out. You are not to make treaties with them. You are not to leave them here. They could either convert or they could leave, or you had to take care of them. You would have to defeat them. Remember what happened to Achan when he kept something he wasn't supposed to. If those people didn't meet the criteria of convert or leave, then they were to suffer the same fate as the high places and the temples. They were to be destroyed. And if they're kept, then that influence is still in the land. So God's response, when they were not faithful, okay, I will no longer drive out before them any of the nations Joshua left when he died. I did this to test Israel to see whether they would keep the Lord by walking in it. Interesting. I'm not sure I transcribed that properly. Let me make sure of this one. Okay, I will no longer drive out before them any of the nations Joshua left when he died. I did this to test Israel and to see whether they would keep the Lord's way by walking in it as their fathers did. So I forgot the possessive there. So I did this to test Israel to see whether or not they would keep the Lord's way by walking in it as their fathers had. So when Israel chose not to drive the Canaanites out of the land, but keep some of them around, God was no longer with them in battle, and they were unable to take the land. So again, if certain things that were supposed to be driven out were not driven out, as happened with Achan, then they suffer the covenant curse of disobedience. So the test then, the Lord left the Canaanites to test Israel, to determine if they would keep the Lord's commands he had given their fathers through Moses. But the Israelites settled among the Canaanites. Not good, not good, don't do that, that's not what you're supposed to do. The Israelites took their daughters as wives for them and gave their own daughters to their sons and worshipped their gods. Warning, warning. Does this sound like keeping the Lord's commandments? What were they not to do? They were to not leave their worship implements. They were not to make treaties with them. They were not to intermarry. But they settled among them. They gave their daughters and they took, as wives to the Canaanites, and they took Canaanite wives for their sons, and they would worship their gods. Those three things, right there, settling among them, intermarrying, worshiping their gods, those are the three things they weren't allowed to do. Remember that chart that we had on the other page. So does this sound like keeping the Lord's commandments? No, it's the opposite of it. And the result? Covenant blessing and victory is withdrawn. And not just that, but we actually see the escalation of the covenant curses. So what you're going to see here in a little bit, this is some original work in trying to illustrate what happens as you go through the book of Judges to see the escalation of the covenant curses. If you remember from last week, we talked about in the blessings and curses section, remember, if they do not obey, curses. If they still don't obey, sevenfold curses. If they still don't obey, sevenfold curses. If they still don't obey, sevenfold curses. But if they repent, then I will remember my covenant with them and I will restore them. All right? So there's an escalation if they don't repent, but there's a restoration if they do. So you might have heard of something before, or maybe not, called the Judges cycle. So the middle of Judges, from chapter 3 through the end of chapter 17, is where you see the cycles. It's the same kind of idea over and over again. And my thesis here is that you see an escalation of the covenant curses as you would expect based on Leviticus 26. So here you're going to see there's 6 of these cycles in Judges. If you're familiar, down here, Israel's deliverer, you might be familiar with these different sections by the name of the judge, or the deliverer. So Othniel, Ehud, Deborah and Barak, Gideon, Jephthah, and Samson. So those are the main characters in these cycles from chapter 3 through chapter 17. So here's the formula. Here's what happens. The Israelites do what is evil in the Lord's sight. So there are all the verses. That's kind of a marker of the new section in Judges. In some cases, it says explicitly what they were doing. They worship the Canaanite gods. Remember, they're not supposed to do that. So then they're handed over to their enemies. Different enemies every time. These are Canaanites who are still in the land. They should have been able to drive them out. They should have driven them out. They didn't, so now they're subject to defeat. Then the Israelites cry out to Yahweh. So remember Leviticus 26:40. So, but if they repent, then I will remember my covenant with them. I will remember the land. So you see the Israelites crying out to Yahweh. Yahweh then raises up a deliverer, the word judge. So judge is it's really not that good of a word for us to continue using, because we think of a judge as excuse me, very much in a legal construct. That's why I'm using the word deliverer. Forgive me. Because that's really the way that we should be thinking about it. So Yahweh raises up a deliverer, and then the deliverer is able to, in most of these cases, get Israelite out from being underneath their enemies. They have victory over their enemies, and then there's peace in the land. So that's the cycle formula. They do evil, they're handed over to their enemies, they cry out to Yahweh, Yahweh raises up the deliverer, and there's peace in the land. So you can see all that right here. Now, I want to point something out here. Let's look at this. So, cycles 1, 2, and 3, you see this formula pretty clearly. By the time you get to cycle number 4, so the Gideon cycle, you would get something a little bit different. So, see in the 1st and 5th cycles, they worship the Canaanite gods. This is the evil done in the Lord's sight. And so then they're cursed. Their enemies will rule over them. They don't have victory in battle. And then when they're delivered, they have peace in the land. After the deliverance, though, in the Gideon cycle, so Gideon's a remarkable character. So Gideon is actually raised up, and one of the first things he does is goes and smashes the altars of his father, the pagan altars. And this is really significant because that's what they were supposed to do. That was part of the command to drive out the Canaanites. Remember, we saw smash their altars, burn their poles, break their high places, etc. So he does that. But in 833, and I'll read this real quick. So at the very end, when Gideon died, the Israelites turned and prostituted themselves with the Baals and made Baal Berith their god. After that deliverance, they go back to worshiping their pagan gods. Then what happens? Well, Abimelech happens in the middle there, and I've decided that we're not going to cover Abimelech. Suffice to say, Abimelech was very bad. But you see the cycle begin again in chapter 10. So they did what was evil in the Lord's sight. They worshiped the Canaanite gods. They cry out to Yahweh. There's no raising up of a deliverer. Jephthah is the anti-hero, so to speak, and Samson as well for that matter. But they cry out to Yahweh, and Yahweh doesn't want to hear it. Judges chapter 10. So, 10, they cry out to the Lord, we've sinned against you. We've abandoned our God and worshipped the Baals. So 10:10. The Lord said to the Israelites, when the Egyptians, Amorites, Ammonites, Philistines, Sidonians, Amalekites, and Maonites oppressed you, and you cried out to me, did I not deliver you from their power? But you have abandoned me and worshipped other gods, therefore I will not deliver you again. Go cry out to the gods you have chosen. Let them deliver you in your time of oppression. Okay. So the Israelites said again in verse 15, we have sinned, deal with us as you see fit, only deliver us today. So they got rid of the foreign gods among them and worshipped the Lord. He became weary of Israel's misery. There is a lot of ambiguity right there, but God does not respond in the same way. You see in 3:9, 3:15, 4:4 through 10, 6:11 through 21. So Yahweh raised up the deliverer. Jephthah never gets that. Yahweh's weariness is left quite ambiguous. I will refrain from giving my opinion on that. But suffice to say that specific literary figure or literary formula that you see in the previous cycles is not there for Jephthah. They cry out, and God says, no. I go and cry out to the gods that you've chosen. Then in the Samson cycle, they don't even cry out. They do what was evil, they're handed over to their enemies, but now they're not even acknowledging Yahweh. Samson, again, very much an anti-hero. Incredibly interesting. If you're a Bible study teacher, don't use Samson as an example, like for kids, about being faithful. Samson is very, very not good. There's, a lot to even say that at the very end, when Samson brings down the Philistine temple, he is, delivering Israel in spite of his own unfaithfulness. And you also notice the peace in the land blessing is absent in the 5th and 6th cycles. So it's interesting that God's response in verses, chapter 10, verses 11 through 14 is, you worshipped other gods, so go cry out to them now, I won't deliver you again. When they had done that before, they had worshipped the other gods before. So what happened after the Gideon cycle? So after Gideon's death, the Israelites again commit apostasy, but in a way that will change Yahweh's disposition towards them for the rest of the book. As soon as Gideon died, the Israelites relapsed and prostituted themselves with the Baals, making Baal-berith their god. Baal-berith was a Shechemite deity whose name as rendered means Lord of the Covenant. So Baal, Lord, Berith, Covenant. So Lord of the Covenant. Dan Block, Dan Block, in his commentary on Judges. So in making Baal-berith their god, Israel went beyond mere harlotry with the local Baals. They have displaced Yahweh, their own covenant God, with this Baal of the covenant. So this isn't just, prostituting themselves with other gods, with another deity. They've associated them with a new covenant God. This is divorce. They have pledged themselves to another God. So after the Gideon cycle, it's not just stepping out of the covenant. It is making a covenant with another God. It's basically like, divorcing Yahweh and marrying somebody else. That's what happens after the Gideon cycle. After the replacement of Yahweh with Baal-berith, there are numerous further indications Israel has rejected Yahweh, become completely Canaanized, which is the thing that wasn't supposed to happen. Remember Leviticus 18. You are not to be like them. To continue to worship other gods. Judah abdicates their task of driving the Canaanites out of the land. Basically, it gets this form of Stockholm syndrome. They're content with their Philistine captors. They try and hand Samson over to the Philistines. The tribe of Dan goes as far as, ironically, sacking a Canaanite city to establish a shrine to Canaanite deities. They go and take out a Canaanite city, which is like, okay, yeah, that's what you're supposed to do. And then they build shrines to pagan idols, which is what you are not supposed to do. Yahweh's response is withdrawing the covenant blessing that they still had and escalating the curses. Judges 19 tells a very familiar story. It's a story of Sodom and Gomorrah. If you're not familiar with it, you can go read it. I chose not to put that fully in here, but the story of the Levite and his concubine coming in, it matches up very well with, you're strangers in a strange place. They meet a man who says, don't stay in the square, come to my house. The men come to the door. They want to have sex with the Levite. They say no. His concubine is taken and raped, and just like the Sodom and Gomorrah story. So it's an ugly story, but it has a point. The point of this is that Israel has descended to the level of Sodom and Gomorrah by the end of Judges 19. So this whole descent, when they were in covenant blessing in Joshua, they were getting victory. Yahweh was speaking with them consistently. By the end of Judges, they are as bad as Sodom and Gomorrah. So then there's the civil war, the dogpile on Benjamin war, because Benjamin was responsible for the outrage against the Levite and his concubine, so that the Benjaminites were the ones that were playing the part of Sodom and Gomorrah in Judges 19. There's no peace in the land. Yahweh's gone silent. He's turned his face from them. These are all covenant curses. And the book of Judges ends with the line, in those days there was no king in Israel. Everyone did what was right in his own eyes. which is also a formula that you see throughout the end of Judges. So we've seen how the covenant blessings work out when they're faithful in Joshua. We've seen how the covenant curses work out in Judges when they are unfaithful. So that's going to be all for now. It's kind of a bleak ending, so go on to the next episode. We're going to talk about what then happens afterwards. What happens afterwards is the establishment of the Israelite monarchy. And we'll see how that goes through the exile and then return. So thanks for watching, and see you next time.